Press record. Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Colchester podcast with Martin Goss. My name's Craig Fuchs. Tonight we're going to be talking about some local issues that affect the people of Colchester and also some national news that's in the headlines this week. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the garden waste collection scheme, which has changed from early 2024 and some additional fees now apply to that, and it's been a policy change that's happened for Colchester City Council, which has been controversial, and some people have found it quite challenging to face additional costs in terms of the collection of their garden waste. So I'm going to put some of those comments and questions that I've seen on social media to Martin tonight to get his commentary and his feedback on why such a scheme has been implemented. And then a bit later on, we're going to be moving on to talk about the post office scandal, I suppose we could call it, in terms of what is going on with that and Martin's take on that. So thank you for joining us, Martin. And tell us a little bit about, give us an overview of the changes that have happened to garden waste collection for the residents of Colchester.
So as of January the 15th onwards, the garden waste collection service has become subscription only, which is what the majority of councils do in the UK, because over 65% of them do charge. So we're in the latter quartile of those charging, and unfortunately, due to the current financial climate, decreased government grants, inflation, etc., we've been forced to obviously look at other income streams. Garden waste is a discretionary service, so it's not actually mandated by government, by law, that councils have to collect garden waste, hence why the majority of councils already charge. And in fact, in Essex, three councils are introducing it. It's Colchester, Braintree, and also Basildon. And those councils are slightly ahead of us in starting that service. So other councils have also been forced to look at that in Essex for the same reasons. So the garden waste collection ceased just before Christmas, and then it starts again, as I mentioned, next week on a subscription-only service for those that want it. Now, obviously, this time of year, it's going to be slower because obviously the weather dictates that there won't be people necessarily cutting grass, etc. There will still be people using the service, but obviously it starts to pick up in the spring, in April time. So what we've tried to do is to try to give people 15 months for the price of 12, so that when they sign up, they get 3 months extra included. So it runs from January this year through until April 2025, when the next subscription would be payable. And the cost of it is £35 admin fee, and which includes the bin, and then £55 per year for pickup of the bin for the year. And then if people decide to renew it next year in April 2025, or to even join the scheme in April 2025, then it will be £55 per year to empty it. So that's the cost of having to have garden waste collected. Now, obviously, you don't have to use the service. You can go to the recycling centre to take garden waste, and people that don't have much garden waste will probably do that and book in and do it. And of course, there are a number of recycling centres around as well that people can use. It isn't just the one at Shrub End. And in fact, some people on the north of Colchester actually tell me they use Manningtree because it's really easy to get to, rather than cutting across Colchester. So, and obviously there's a recycling centre in Mersey, etc. So there are different recycling centres around. And of course, you can also compost. And as part of this, people do get a reduced compost bin if that's what they want to do. And some people are going to do that and then reuse the compost on their garden as well. So what we've tried to do is be as flexible as possible, learn from other councils. We've certainly consulted many other councils to talk about fly tipping. Does it increase fly tipping? And generally the answer is no, it doesn't. And in Colchester at the minute, fly tipping is down 20% year on year as well. So it will obviously be closely monitored anyway, but clearly people have asked me a lot of questions. So obviously it's all researched and clearly I know the subject and have responded to people honestly. You know, it is a huge regret we've had to do it. It's not something I'm personally a fan of. And it is unfortunately something we've had to do to stop us cutting other services. And it also, what we've also done as well for staff welfare, and also to try and put in place a uniform service, is it's wheelie bin only, because our staff do suffer quite high sickness where they are manually emptying bags into the back of dust carts. And it is proven that on wheelie bin routes, they have less sickness because in effect the machine does all of the work. And they do, you know, staff that are on the black sack and the garden waste routes, they're literally probably throwing in the back of a dust cart anything up to 20 tons of rubbish a day between the team, which you can imagine is a lot. And the dust carts, the black dust carts and the garden waste dust carts, and they feel like have to go away and tip and then come back and actually complete the route. So an average employee is probably walking 10 to 15 miles a day. So it's a really strenuous job. And our staff have certainly asked, if you're going to do this, can you actually make it uniform and can we have wheelie bins? So there's been a lot of consultation with staff, obviously feedback from residents, and this is the service that we have landed on, and it starts next week. So people have been signing up, wheelie bins have been getting dropped off, stickers have been sent out for those that already have wheelie bins in certain parts of Colchester. And obviously people don't want to pay extra. I don't particularly want to pay extra, but it is a discretionary service and it is not included in council tax. And that's why government under legislation allows it and has done for many years, decades in some cases, for some councils, for them to charge.
So going through the post from Colchester City Council's Facebook page and reading some of the comments, the first one that jumps out is a £35 admin fee. And it could be said that for those that don't have a wheelie bin already, that £35 is a reasonable cost for a wheelie bin if you don't own one already, whether you own that wheelie bin or whatever happens with it afterwards. But for those that already have a wheelie bin that has been supplied by the council, why is there the need for a £35 admin fee for a sticker to go on the front of your wheelie bin?
It's because it needed to be uniform across Colchester. So as part of the terms and conditions, the wheelie bin will be guaranteed as part of that fee. So whether you've got a 6-year-old wheelie bin or a brand new one, obviously if you live in Mile End, Stanway and other parts of Colchester, they've had wheelie bins for some years and it's worked very successfully. So what it does is it guarantees that wheelie bin for life against any damage for the length of the scheme. And what it also means is everybody pays the same fee and everyone is tied into the same terms and conditions. So that's why it was done in that way, for a uniform approach. And what we also did, which a lot of other councils don't do, for those most in need and on certain benefits, there is also some help where other councils don't actually do that. So again, Colchester trying to be as flexible and as helpful as it can be to make the scheme as affordable as possible has included some reduction as well if people apply, and then obviously it'll be looked at.
So for somebody that has a wheelie bin already, that they're guaranteed a wheelie bin going forward, but they've already got one. So what does that guarantee really mean in practice?
Well, it means if it gets damaged, that it will just get replaced free of charge in perpetuity of you being part of the scheme. Whereas before you may well have ended up having to pay for it. So it in effect gives you guarantee that the scheme covers your wheelie bin. And that's all part of the terms and conditions. And it also means that the scheme is uniform for everybody, that everyone pays the same whilst they're part of the scheme.
Okay. What would you say to people that say something along the lines of, I'll stuff this, I'll just put it in my black bags, and nobody been on the wiser?
So obviously the guys that do the routes, particularly if you're still on a black bag route, we'll see that, we'll work it out, because they're obviously good at what they do and they realise what's in the bag. So for instance, you would be able to tell if somebody's putting their recycling in. So they will be able to spot it, and if they spot it, they will sticker it and it won't go. So there will be checks done to make sure that people don't suddenly start trying to fill their black sacks up. And in reality, because people use their allocation of a wheelie bin or 3 black sacks, which is what most people have, it would be quite difficult to start putting bags of grass in there, because you'd use your capacity really quickly. If you think about cutting your lawn, it wouldn't take long to fill up a couple of black sacks potentially with garden waste. So it would get spotted, and people try and do it now actually. So where people might not have the white Hessian sacks, they put it in black sacks. Well, obviously that's spotted, and it doesn't get taken because it's clearly not presented properly. So it would be exactly the same, and will be monitored, just like all fly tipping is, or wrong rubbish in sacks, etc. now.
So there has been research into the potential increase in fly tipping then.
So we've liaised with a number of other councils, and obviously they have historic records, particularly councils that have been running garden waste collections for many years, places like Suffolk, Tendring, etc. And there has not been a huge increase in fly tipping of garden waste. There's always been a problem of fly tipping of other types of waste, but generally people going around fly tipping grass cuttings or branches or trees doesn't happen. So it doesn't have a direct correlation, and it is not a major issue. Obviously, other types of fly tipping remain an issue, we've got a couple of prosecutions going on at the moment. But garden waste, generally, no, people can't really just go around throwing grass cuttings all over the pavement, for instance.
Okay. So what you say that there's flexibility in this service. It seems that there is either one service or there isn't a service. You either pony up your £35 admin fee and £55 a year, or nothing. It seems that Tendring offer something along the lines of a pay-as-you-go scheme. Was that considered for Colchester?
Most councils don't do pay-as-you-go. I wasn't even aware that Tendring does. I think you just pay an annual fee, from what I've seen, because we've spoken to them. I'm not aware they do pay-as-you-go. The problem is pay-as-you-go would be quite hard to manage if people want to suddenly just have the odd ad hoc collection, because you've got to log it, you've got to make sure the bin has got a sticker on it, and obviously the person is registered, and you can't really have people keep hopping in and out of a scheme. It would make it an admin nightmare. So that's why we haven't gone with it. That's not to say that we won't look at changes in the future. So one of the changes that we are going to investigate is whether people can pay via monthly payment. The reason we didn't go with monthly direct debit, and we did look at it, or monthly card payment, is that the councils that tried to do that had real issues with people just cancelling payments, and then you're starting to try and chase people. What that then does is adds cost, because you need the IT platform and the staff to start doing it and sending letters out or emails, making phone calls. So councils that did do direct debit or direct card payment every month or whatever period they used, they stopped doing it because it became a really difficult service to offer. We may look at some form of PayPal service or something like that. So we have committed to look at more flexible payments in the future. But the bottom line is we had to get the service up and running, and that's what we've done, because we've obviously had to configure and build IT platforms and get everything tested and ready to go, get the bins procured, etc.
For a layperson, that's quite difficult to get hold of, really, because their council tax is most likely paid monthly and has been for probably 25 years.
Yes, some people do, but council tax, obviously, if you don't pay it, then you get chased and there's a debt collection process. But all that can come with cost, especially if you start taking people to court. For a garden waste fee, you know, of 90 quid in the first year and 55 in the other, potentially council tax is a much higher cost. And you've got to have a look at the cost of chasing debt. And therefore, if you put in more staff to have to chase debt of the garden waste, then it then makes it untenable, because in effect you're adding extra cost to it. Whereas council tax, you have to collect it by law, and therefore, and also don't forget that the council tax goes to many other organisations. It goes to Essex, it goes to the police, it goes to fire, and also a parish or community or town council if you've got one, say Widenhoe, Myland. So obviously those organisations are expecting their money. So you have one collection authority, but obviously that is then disseminated off to all the other councils when it's collected. So
if this isn't being collected, and it isn't something that is that you could be pursued for legally, then it's a commercial service that the council are offering, then, as opposed to just needing to charge extra council tax.
Well, in effect, this is completely separate from council tax. What you also can't do under the government legislation is you can't charge on council tax separately for garden waste. If you do it, it's a completely separate contract, and it's a completely separate payment, and it's a completely separate bill. And that is how the legislation is set out. And that's why councils have to bill for it separately. Because you're quite right. People have said, well, can't you just add it to my council tax and I'll pay it through that? And the answer is no, it's not allowed. The other thing to bear in mind, another comment I've had is, well, why can't you just work out the percentage extra and add it to council tax? And of course, the answer is you can't do that, because by law, again, government law, you can only put council tax up by 3%. So to give you an example, Colchester gets 11p in every pound collected. So the majority of the money goes to Essex. I think it's something like 76p in the pound goes to Essex, and then the rest of that is to the fire authority, the police, and then a tiny amount to parish, community, or town councils. So again, by law, you are prohibited from putting up council tax by more than 3%. So if you think about when inflation was running at 10 or 11%, which is partially the reason that councils have got deficits appearing because of huge inflation increases, then you can't just load it to council tax. So obviously, like with any household budget, you have to make it balanced. So obviously, looking for new income streams or putting up fees and charges that are outside of council tax, you know, like hiring a a football pitch or whatever, they all have to be looked at, because they are regulated very, very differently.
They're not council tax services. These are commercial services.
Exactly. Exactly. It's a bit like if you use the crematorium, that's not in your council tax. That's a separate fee that you would use to use those services. So you're absolutely right. And council budgets are made up of not just council tax and government grants. They also get made up of fees and charges and commercial services that come, as you quite rightly say, from other parts of the...
Like squash courts that we talked about last time.
Indeed, we certainly did. I hope you're still playing.
No, I haven't. Can't afford it.
So yeah, you're absolutely right. So Leisure World is a good example that's not a commercial service. In effect, it's sport and leisure, but there is, some subsidy in there that we talked about last time.
Yeah. So it's more broadly that we think about climate and the environment, and everybody, or the vast majority of people now, are becoming more tuned in to their environmental impact and recycling and the like. Why, your thoughts and comments on this, why isn't it part of council tax to provide this type of service? Because it is core to recycling. There is, for people, perhaps the temptation for some people to try and put their garden waste in black bags, so they go to landfill, which would be a waste of something that could be composted down. And are there any alternatives to not penalise, but to charge for the collection of waste that would go to landfill? Because surely, now that we are considering the climate change and the impact on the environment, why is it that garden waste collection falls outside of what the council provides? Surely in 2024 that we're now we're now aware of environmental impact and how things can be recycled, that more broadly, this could be a service that is provided nationally by the government?
Well, it's a really good question. And what's been happening recently is government has been looking at what councils must collect from the curbside and what recycling, and not necessarily how they do it. That's up to the individual councils, but actually what they need to collect. So there has been a lot of work being done on the Environment Act, looking at what councils should provide, whether it's chargeable or not. And there was a thought by government for a very brief period in one of the white papers that came out that garden waste should be included and should be free. Now, obviously, they've now backtracked on that anyway. So there was a thought for a very brief moment in one of the more recent white papers. But what government is doing, I think it's from 2026 or thereabouts, they are going to make a collection of certain types of recycling and plastic and Tetra Packs, I believe, as well, from the doorstep. So every council has to ensure that Tetra Packs, certain types of plastic, cardboard cans, garden waste, food waste, are all collected, because some councils don't collect garden waste. Some councils don't collect food waste. And in fact, one of the interesting things I found out from speaking to some of the other Essex councils is some of the Essex councils mixing food waste and garden waste together. And apparently it's a nightmare to try and recycle it, because they should be separate. So under the government legislation, it's saying you have to present food waste separately, put it into one stream of recycling, and garden waste also has to be separate. But obviously garden waste is not a mandatory collection, and it will continue to be discretionary. The collection of black waste and recycling and all the types of recycling that government will legislate from 2026, or whenever they bring in the changes to the Environment Act, will mean all councils have to do that, and it will be free. The only chargeable service is garden waste. In terms of black sack, Essex County Council, disappointingly, is still putting all of our black sacks into the ground, and they're going to be doing that until 2026, until the law changes. Because from 2026, I believe, councils are not allowed to put stuff into landfill, or they have to reduce it significantly, and they have to go off to plants to be processed. And what I mean by that is turned into energy. So I believe Suffolk County Council recently announced they've got a big new plant opening, or they've got a new plant open somewhere in Suffolk that processes all of the black waste and turns it into energy, because in effect it gets burned cleanly. So it makes electricity, which is great, because in the current energy crisis, that's exactly what we need. And it's better to do that than put it in the ground, because it stays there for a generation.
How can it be said that it's burnt cleanly? Because you wouldn't know what's in it.
Well, there's processing that goes on with it. They don't just literally get a black sack and put it on a bonfire. It obviously has to go into a proper plant. It is processed, and then the majority of it is sent off to be cleanly burned. And when I say cleanly burned, what I mean is that the legislation is really tight on this. And it's a bit like the legislation that came in years ago with what happened to the effluents that came out of power stations. It all had to have big chimneys and lots of filters and processing to get rid of everything that's being pushed out into the atmosphere. So a good example is in power stations, chipboard was coming as one of the byproducts, I believe, of coal power stations. And that's something that came in decades ago. To ensure that it doesn't just pump out into the atmosphere. So the same would be with burning, and it's happening in Sweden and other European countries quite happily without an issue, and it's generating electricity and getting rid of waste and stops it going into landfill. Because to be frank, the worst thing you can do with any black sack waste is put it in the ground, because it's there for a generation. It eventually then gives off methane. It's got to be managed. And it is there for 50 to 100 years.
Complex issue, isn't it?
It is.
It's difficult to get your head around or it's difficult for me to get my head around the fact that, given that a lot that goes into my black bag waste is single-use plastic stuff that says can't be recycled.
Yeah.
Or that says to be recycled at a big main supermarket, and the nearest one to me is Asda, and there isn't a soft plastic recycling there, as far as I'm aware.
No, I think they used to, but they took it away again.
Right. And
So yes, so you're right, it is, and legislation is changing to improve it, to ensure that everything is either recycled as much as possible or is cleanly dealt with as much as possible.
Well, it's interesting if that can be done. I can't presently get my head around how that might be. So in terms of the green waste, when that goes off to the council's recycling centre, what happens to it in terms of the process of it being recycled? Because it says on the green caddies for food waste that this is going to be going off and turned into compost. What happens to that compost?
So food waste is turned into energy. So it goes off to be processed in Housestead, and it is basically put into big tanks with microorganisms. And what happens is those microorganisms eat the food waste that you put in, and then they give off gas, and that gas can be used to make energy. And therefore your food literally is any waste food that you put in your green caddy goes back into an MBT plant and goes off to make energy. And it's a clean process. And again, if you put food in the black waste sack, it goes in the ground, and that will give off methane, which is not a good gas because it has to be managed. It's not good for the environment. So putting it through this process guarantees it's cleanly dealt with, and you're actually, the light in my study here could be coming from food waste.
Okay, that's not clean energy. So you're still burning the gas that would be coming out would be something like methane, and then you're still burning it. It would still be producing CO2.
So I've got a diagram that explains it. I haven't got it here to share on the podcast, but there is a scientific diagram I have that shows how it works.
Love a scientific diagram. So perhaps I'll have that next time.
So I'll definitely send it to her, or I'll have it for the next podcast, and we can pop it up because I've got it on PowerPoint. But it is a clean process.
Well, I suppose anything where we're reusing what would have ordinarily gone into landfill
Exactly.
something different.
Exactly.
We're not burning fossil fuels that have come out of the ground. I suppose it has to be commended.
No, exactly.
What about the garden waste?
The garden waste goes off to Birch, just past the zoo. There's a big area there that you wouldn't know because it's well off the highway, and the dust carts turn up. They tip the garden waste out, drive off, and it gets processed. So I've been there when I've done a green garden waste collection. I've been out for a shift. So I've collected it from some of our customers' doorsteps, and then I've gone to Birch with it, and you literally just see the dust cart back in, tip it, drive out, leave it, and there are different piles of garden waste, and they're literally fermenting. So you can literally see steam coming off them as they're fermenting, and they get treated, turned over, etc., by obviously big diggers. And then eventually it goes off to be sold, to be put back into back into garden centres, etc., which we will buy. So it works well.
Is that a revenue stream for the council then?
So what happens is Colchester is a waste Colchester is a waste collection authority. So we don't actually have a licence to dispose of recycling or garden waste. So what happens is Essex County Council holds the licence for disposal. So what happens is we would take the rubbish, or it would be collected. In some cases, the waste is the recycling is collected and taken away to be processed, but we don't process it. So what happens with garden waste is that Essex has a contract, and they have something called carbon credits, which they have to do for government, and it's all part of the legislation. And then what happens, depending on so Essex gets the income in effect for the garden waste through carbon credits, and then they pass that back to the various district councils, to give them back some of that revenue or carbon credit for the garden waste that's been collected, and that's how it works. But obviously the income received and the carbon credit isn't anywhere near enough to cover the cost of running the service. To run the garden waste service is £1.8 million with the vehicles and the staff, etc. And the income that would come from that is tiny in comparison. Again, it's the same with you get an income from recycling glass, cans, paper. And I think I've explained before that the income from that is a bit like the stock market. The spot rate of glass could be really high because there's a real need for it on the market, or there could be a glut of glass, and therefore it pushes the price down. And after China, a number of years ago, I think it was just pre-COVID or during COVID, stopped taking plastic, there was a worldwide problem because all that plastic had to find places to go. And therefore, there was no demand for plastic. Therefore, in effect, you had to pay to get rid of it rather than get an income. So paper has been the same, although at the moment paper is getting, I think, a good income, but it all changes. So you could get pretty good income from recycling, or it could be that you actually have to pay to get it processed.
Right.
So it can change quite fundamentally. The worst and most difficult is plastic. That is the most difficult. Glass is generally pretty straightforward. Cardboard and paper are quite straightforward. But plastic remains the biggest problem, I think.
Right. Well, it's not just that, it's a fundamental problem, isn't it? The plastic that we have that can't be recycled, that ends up in the sea and then in the food chain. It's a big
absolutely. So that's where the actual food producers and manufacturers have got a huge issue they need to deal with, and some are dealing with it better than others. But again, I think that's where government has rowed back, because the Environment Act legislation was going to get really tough with producers and manufacturers. And I think the legislation that's coming forwards is a lot weaker, unfortunately.
Well, I think there's going to be some big political change that happens before we even get to 2026. So, that this environmental act that you're talking about is probably going to go in the bin before we get there, isn't it?
Well, I think it's quite advanced, and I hope that it wouldn't. And I hope there would also be improvements to it, particularly around manufacturers and packaging, because that's really where you've got to sort it out at source. Why do you need to send a piece of broccoli in wrapped in a bit of plastic? Have it loose, put it in a paper bag, or don't even put it in a bag. Yeah. So, there's got to be a fundamental shift in both our attitude as consumers and also the attitude and technology used by manufacturers.
In most supermarkets now, it's quite difficult to do a weekly shop of your fruit and veg without picking up something wrapped in plastic that really doesn't need to be.
That's right. And I remember Iceland was one of the retailers that really tried to pioneer losing plastic. Although Iceland isn't necessarily a place you'd go for all your green grocery, but they did carry it. And one of the things they tried to do was, rather than having bananas wrapped in plastic, they put them in a cardboard package that you could pick up, and sales dropped because of the change. And it's still the same bananas, they're just in a cardboard carrier rather than plastic. It's unbelievable, isn't it? And Iceland also changed to paper bags and got rid of plastic bags at the checkout, but they've gone back to plastic again because the paper bags, the bottoms used to fall out.
I think Morrison's have paper bags, don't they? But we haven't got one in Colchester.
No, we haven't. We still want one. We're still campaigning for one.
I know that's a topic that pops up on social media, isn't it?
It
the
does.
absence of Morrison's in the Colchester.
And yeah, I mean, I've spoken to the senior leadership team at Morrison's, had some calls with them. They did actually put in a bid on a property in Colchester, but they were outbid by somebody else. Right. What Morrison's don't want to do is have a supermarket right next door to another one. They want to have it in a geographic area where there's not as much competition. So they're not just going to suddenly buy somewhere next to Asda or Lidl or Aldi or whoever else, they have quite strict criteria about how far they are from competition, and the location they had was actually perfect. But unfortunately, they were outbid. There you go. That's a bit of trivia for you.
There you go. I'm sure some people listening will be interested to know that Morrison's are looking to come to Colchester.
Yeah, and I still touch base time to time, but it's about finding the right location at the right price. So hopefully they may find somewhere.
Okay. So let's move on. And unless there's anything else that you want to tell us about,
No, I think
waste,
to be fair, we've covered the waste side of things really in depthly. So I think hopefully, there's some stuff that people have learned.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, for your insight into that. A news story that I think I've been aware of for quite some time, but it's gone to the back of my mind, but has resurfaced. I'm sure it has for everyone, about the post office, what we can only really call a scandal. And just sort of in preparing for today, see that has been going on for in excess of 25 years. That the post office decided to implement a new computer system, and somebody with, as you have, Martin, an IT background, might be able to give us a bit more insight as to how these things are procured and put in place. Put in place this new computer system, and immediately after that system has gone into place, people that have had a long relationship, career with the post office as employees and self-employed sub-postmasters started being convicted of fraud and ended up going into prison. And there's even a story of somebody taking their own life as a result of these accusations, these prosecutions that have gone through as a result of this farce that's happened. So just give us your thoughts on this topic as an overview, and then perhaps we can get into it in a bit more detail.
Yeah, so as you say, I've worked in IT or project management IT for about 25 years, and I started as a graduate trainee with Eastern Electricity in 1998, roughly about the time when the Horizon platform was procured, being built and implemented by the post office. And I used to get Computer Weekly because you could get it sent to your office, and I used to subscribe to it. And read it for a number of years, and I noticed that the Horizon system was mentioned in Computer Weekly, and it was something that I have followed ever since seeing it, particularly obviously as I've procured and implemented new platforms myself, and seen them implemented or built them. So it would have gone through a thorough government procurement exercise, because the post office at the time was actually part of Royal Mail, I think, in history. And then they separated out to be Royal Mail, just the delivery side, and then obviously the post office was kept separate, but not floated off like Royal Mail partially was. So this has been building and building, and I think it was the ITV drama that was shown very recently that really has now started the snowball effect of actually sorting this out properly, because this has appeared in the press on and off, and obviously from a personal point of view, I've kept an interest in it because I've been following it for years, but it wouldn't be something that everybody knows about, and it certainly wouldn't be something that people have necessarily been talking about in the morning over breakfast, but now it is, and people are really, really angry. Over 700 postmasters prosecuted in some way, shape or form, whether that was for fraud, whether that was some people were sent to prison. People have been bankrupted by it. They've lost their houses, they've lost their reputations, their children have been bullied, people have taken their lives, as you've said. The other thing is, some people have never lived to see the outcome or to get the compensation or to have their name cleared because they've died of old age or illness. And the whole thing is just an utter travesty. And it has been through every government, because this would have started as far back as Tony Blair's government, the late 90s, all the way through, and then into the coalition, and then into the Conservatives when they're on their own from 2015. And there's been 20 post office ministers since 1997, from the Labour government all the way through to the existing Conservative government and during the coalition years. So there's been 20 ministers through that period, 8 Labour, 8 Lib Dem, and 4 Tory in more recent years. So every government and every political party has been in government at some point when this has been going through. But I think the absolute travesty has been the clear misleading and fraud by the post office and by the board of the post office, the leadership of the post office. Paula Bennells was clearly chief executive for a period, who's just handed her CBE back, which I think is the right thing to do. I signed the petition for that. So people have clearly lied, given misinformation to ministers, to civil servants, to prosecutions potentially, and there has to be somebody held to account. There has to be the leadership, and in law now, you can, as a chief executive or a board director, go to prison for corporate manslaughter. So if something happens of quite a significant fraud, or somebody lost their life if they're working for your company, potentially the board of directors or the chief executive could be prosecuted for manslaughter. They call it corporate manslaughter.
Yeah, for if somebody loses a life. But what we're talking about here is that there is a corporation or a corporate entity, the post office, that have paid another corporation to put in place this computer system. And I would imagine that the cost of that, I haven't been able to immediately find the cost of that, but I would imagine that ran to millions upon millions and millions of pounds.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that you've got people that would have worked, had their entire career, their entire livelihood, they would have been pillars of a community, being the sub postmaster, that have never put a foot wrong in their work as a post office operative, whatever the correct terminology might be. The new system goes into place, and then 900 of these people, as I've seen here on Wikipedia, are now being accused of false accounting, fraud, and theft. That nobody has made the connection at a fundamental level that the change that has happened has been this computer system that's gone into place, and then all of these people are suddenly crooks. That if there are, now I wasn't aware until we started talking today that there was such a thing as a post office minister. Now that's not a cabinet post, is it? It's not one of the 4 major offices of the land.
No.
But if there is a post office minister, what has any of whatever political party they've been aligned to, what have they actually been doing? Because if you're the minister for the post office, surely that person is having at least a monthly meeting with the chief executive or the board of the post office and going, all right, guys, how's it going? All right, well, we've just sent another 10 people to prison. Surely any minister would be asking the extra question. And if you are the post office minister, the phrase that we might use in common language be, you've got one job. What on earth has gone on when people start to lose their lives through suicide? So the broader point is, I think it is for many people, is that they lose faith and become very apathetic with all political issues, because you go, right, well, if all the 3 main political parties have all been asleep on the job with this, who do I vote for?
So you're right that it was a third party called Fujitsu that is still trading, and I believe they've got something like £6 billion of government contracts for various IT platforms of HMRC and other parts of government. And that's worrying if there are similar issues in some of those platforms as well, and hopefully more due diligence will be getting taken. But going right back to the point you made, I think the fundamental issue is the fact that the post office, I think, has been pushed hard and for answers by a number of areas, whether it's ministers, government, solicitors, postmasters, and they've all been stonewalled or just lied to by a corporation. And I think that it's only in the last few years, when it's gone to the High Court, where I think it was about 35 postmasters were had their convictions overturned, that all this has started to come to fruition, because it was only, I think, very, very recently this happened. And this drama has now really brought it to the fore for people. Because, as we said earlier, lots of people didn't know this was going on, because it kind of bubbles up and disappears. So there's a fundamental problem with both the Post Office board, the culture, the secrecy, the lying. It's just clearly the whole organisation at head office level was just not right, completely broken. And as for Fujitsu, there are currently 2 ex-employees, both now retired, one in their 60s and one in their early 70s, who were in effect the brains and the architects behind the platform. And I believe one of them actually testified in court as an expert in one of the cases that was featured in the ITV drama recently. And they're now being investigated by the police. So it's now time for the police to continue that, investigating Fujitsu, and also investigating the Post Office board that were there at the time, and potentially bringing charges. So I believe that's happening. And I do hope that some people end up in court and obviously are dealt with accordingly. Now, obviously, of course, we must say that everyone is innocent until proven guilty. But in the case of the way the Post Office acted, they did their own private prosecutions. That's all come to light. Private civil prosecutions. So they had their own team doing it, and all this has come to light recently. So it's almost like they are not only the Post Office, they seem to have their own legal department to go around prosecuting people. Or helping
in order to recover the funds that were lost as a result of these errors from this.
That's right, because not all the prosecutions in effect were criminal prosecutions, because unless the police get involved and take it to the CPS, and the CPS say, yeah, we'll prosecute, as I understand it, quite a number of the prosecutions were civil prosecutions by the Post Office, rather than through the CPS and through the police. And
so that in it, what we might call small claims court, then, just to recover, because the largest amount that was recovered was less than £10,000, wasn't it?
Yeah, I believe it was.
So small claims court, then.
So yeah, they had their own team doing that, and then in the more serious cases, they would go and do plea bargains to get people to take a lesser charge for the ones being prosecuted by the CPS. But of course, they weren't guilty in the first place. So, it is an absolute travesty, and it does look like government is trying to fast track some legislation to clear everybody and try and get the compensation going on. The thing is, there is apparently 3 different compensation schemes running. Nobody's really received a penny. So what the hell is going on? This has been the compensation scheme has been running for a number of years, and it's not paid out. And I think some of the sums it's offered people are just derisory and frankly quite offensive, because they don't cover the fact they've lost their business, they've lost their reputation, they've potentially lost their house and their livelihood. They're often 70 grand. How does that pay somebody back for decades potentially of this going on, and all the stress and anxiety it's called? It's paltry. In fact, it's actually quite offensive. It's just not good enough.
Well, how does in your view, obviously you're not in Parliament yet, but if you were to find yourself in as a position of a minister and the Post Office minister, with looking back over what's happened over the last 27 years of this situation, what would you be doing now if you were?
Well, I think, given that I'm used to managing IT suppliers, and holding people to account and asking the right questions, I think you would just be more forensic about it. So rather than relying on answers from the board of directors or the civil servants that obviously do a lot of the professional work on behalf of ministers, you would go back and challenge and ask for the evidence. Now, of course, if that evidence that comes across your desk isn't true or is factually incorrect, it could take time for that to surface, because you can keep asking the same question and asking it in different ways and asking for more evidence. But if it all stacks up, which is what the post office were doing, because people were asking questions and being given answers or some evidence, and just being told, it's not the platform. And in fact, in some cases, people were asked to sign agreements that they didn't blame the platform when they're being prosecuted and taking a lesser plea. They've said, we'll accept the lesser plea or whatever they agree during the negotiation, but you mustn't blame the platform. You mustn't blame the Horizon platform. And that was actually put into some people's agreements. Crazy, absolutely crazy. So I think it's just about making sure you ask the questions, you keep asking the questions, and you ask for the evidence. Don't necessarily take things at face value. But the difficulty is if the stuff you're being presented with looks true, looks factually correct, then you have to accept it, especially if you've done extra due diligence on it. It's a bit like we published the recycling figures. Well, I asked what goes into it, how they're calculated, etc. I'm not going to suddenly be going down the recycling centre and checking it all, but it is recorded and logged. So you would hope that would all be factually correct, and it's the same principle. There should be data there should be reports, there should be facts.
Could it be then, in our hypothetical situation, that you're now the post office minister, that you are a knowledgeable person in the IT sector, that you would be able to ask the right questions? Could it be that the 20 people that have been post office minister over the last 27 years have been presented with this stuff from the post office and not known what questions to ask about it? They've just accepted it at face value.
Well, if you look at any ministerial post, if you're in charge of the health service, it doesn't necessarily mean you've been a doctor. If you're in charge of other services, it doesn't necessarily mean, say you're in charge of education, quite a fundamentally important department in the government, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've been a teacher or an education professional. So people are appointed to ministerial positions, but they're not necessarily from that background. A good example, actually, is Steve Webb, who was a Lib Dem MP during the coalition. He was the pensions minister, but he actually was a qualified specialist in pensions.
Yeah.
So he actually understood all the calculations. And I know you've obviously got a background or have had a background in financial services, so you know how complex it is. He actually knew what he was doing because that was his job. So, but that is a rarity in government, that ministers aren't necessarily professionally qualified in what they're leading, and they rely on the civil service, who are qualified or are professionals or have health professionals or whatever. And I think that is a fundamental failing of government, personally.
But that's a systemic problem, though.
Well, it is, because if people stand for election, and depending on what government gets elected, they don't necessarily have 20 doctors in their to appoint in their cabinet. One of them is health minister. You may well have some doctors, to be fair, or some lawyers or whatever, people from professional backgrounds, but you don't necessarily always end up with them in the ministerial positions or the junior minister positions. If you take Will Quince, he's a qualified solicitor. He's had several ministerial positions. I believe he's been Ministry of Defence, and he's been in health, and I think he's been in education as well. So that's a good example where he's a solicitor, but he's not been heading up anything to do with law.
No.
And that's not uncommon.
No. I always find that slightly alarming, that we would have somebody that's the head of defence with no background in that, or the health service, the immediate one that comes to everybody's mind, I'm sure, would be Matt Hancock during being the head of the health service during the pandemic. And you're putting in people's, literally speaking, people's lives in his hands, and mistakes were clearly made because they don't have any clinical knowledge in that.
Yeah, and that's where again you rely on the professionals, and you should take their advice, not ignore it, because that's exactly what they're employed to do. Chris Whitty, for instance, obviously a clear scientific professional.
Yeah. Okay, so what do you think happens next in the world of the post office scandal?
So I think the legislation coming through where they're trying to clear everybody through some process, I can't quite get my head around how they're going to make that work, because in effect government is starting to legislate and mess with the judicial system, which is completely independent, or should be completely independent. So is legislation just going to suddenly, I mean, this surely has to go through some form of court process to clear people. I can't see how legislation through Parliament can just suddenly clear people. It must have to go through some sort of judicial legal process and end up in court somehow. So even if they put the legislation in, I would imagine there'll still have to be court hearings to push it through the right process. But I don't know. That clearly government has got something in mind to try and fast track it. And I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. But I think what really needs to be dealt with is the compensation. The compensation is key for the remaining people that are alive, for them to actually be compensated properly, financially properly, for what's happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else you want to share with the good people of Colchester in this evening's podcast episode, Mr. Goss?
Well, I think we'll close with saying clearly we are going to have a general election this year, and my personal view is I think it will be October. I cannot see that Rishi Sunak will call an early election in May, because their poll ratings are low. There's a lot to do, and governments tend to try and hang on as long as possible to try and make themselves as popular again as possible.
Yeah.
So I suspect the general election will probably be about October time. So it's probably about 10 months away. The other thing you wouldn't do, I mean, 2019 was dreadful because it was held in December, and having been out on the streets, can't really knock on people's doors after about 4 o'clock because it's pitch black, particularly, the elderly. That's unfair. It's not fair on activists who are all volunteers. So October for me ticks boxes on a number of reasons. Firstly, it gives the government some time to try and, put its policies together, make itself popular, but I can't see them pulling it back. And the second thing is actually thinking about the voters and the activists, because people don't want to be going out in cold, icy weather to vote or knock on doors, etc. So October, from a weather perspective, to get people out and keep them engaged and interested, it's a little bit warmer and lighter, particularly if it's done before the clocks go back at the end of October.
Yeah, I think my take on it is that they nailed their colours to the mast in terms of this Rwanda policy, and that they're trying to force that through in any way, shape that they can, and that once they've got a flight off to Rwanda, then that may be that they've proved that policy can work, albeit forced through. I don't know what you're
it's still, even with the changes they're making, it still doesn't appear to be legal, and I just can't ever see any planes taking off with anybody on, and we paid Rwanda even more money. I can't remember what the figure is, but it's tens of millions of pounds, and it's achieved nothing. And the whole thing is just fundamentally flawed, and even members of the Conservative Party are starting to ask questions about it. So we keep writing checks to Rwanda, which just seems utterly bonkers. It's taxpayers' money at the end of the day during a cost of living crisis. And what's it achieving? Nothing. And the legislation isn't achieving anything. And the whole process and thought process behind it is just fundamentally flawed. It's completely broken. And obviously, if there's a change of government, I expect that will totally get buried, completely get buried with a change of government.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to make a great deal of logical sense, but they do seem to have painted themselves into a corner
They
somewhere.
have. No, they absolutely have. And obviously, Suella Braverman was one of the architects of this, although she's no longer around, although she's still a mouthpiece for it off to the side. And they still seem to be trying to push it through, but I just cannot see it get through, because even now, with what they're trying to do and how they're trying to change where the High Court has found holes in it, more holes than Swiss cheese, they still haven't fixed it. And I just don't think they will. And I don't think the people in the UK are behind it either, frankly.
I think most people can see that it doesn't make a great deal of sense and
No.
doesn't achieve what
And yet again, government has wasted tens of millions of pounds of our money.
Okay. Anything else you can add for us, Martin?
No, I think I'm looking forward to the election, and I'm enjoying these podcasts. And we're also happy if people have got suggestions of any subject, then please send them in, and we will debate them. And you can ask me the tough questions, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Okay. Thanks, Martin. I'll see you next time.
Have a good weekend. Thank you so much. Cheers. Bye.